Good afternoon. My name is Theunis Piersma. I work in the Department of Marine Ecology here at the Netherlands Institute for Sea Research, but I am also a professor at the University of Groningen. What I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon is Wadden systems, the connections. How Wadden systems in different parts of the world are connected with each other, but also how Wadden systems are connected with other parts of the globe. And actually, this will be a story of migrant birds, because these are the organisms that actually make the connections. And I'll start my story in the sister area to the Wadden Sea, the Bandarguin, on the Sahara shore in the country of Mauritania, 5,000 kilometers approximately to the south, close to the village that you see in the background of Iwik. Well, this is close to the village of Iwik, and you see that on this place we can have a demonstration of connectedness with the Wadden Sea at 4,500 kilometers, but also beyond the Wadden Sea to Taimyr Peninsula and the Russian Arctic. And what it means, I'll come back to that later in my talk. But the Wadden Sea and the Bandarguin are also connected with Wadden systems further south, like the Bijugos archipelago in Guinea-Bissau, all the way down to South Africa. Langebaan Lagoon is the terminus of this flyway of birds. Now, to demonstrate this flyway, I'll give you an example of an individual spoonbill. This is the spoonbill Bonifacius that is held in the hands of Hassan Oud Mohammed Al Hassan, a biologist from Mauritania, from the Bandarguin, that works with us both in Mauritania and in the Wadden Sea. Connectedness in itself. As you can see, this spoonbill carries a small transmitter. Here, Hassan releases the spoonbill, and then the spoonbill goes about doing its things. Also, it's logging its presence, and at some point in the year, we were able to retrieve the information about the behavior of these birds, but also about its movements. And after a breeding season, a successful breeding season in the Wadden Sea, this spoonbill actually moved south. As you can see, along the coast of Europe, hugging the coast almost, but then crossing the bays of Brittany, along the Bay of Biscay, and then crossing the whole width of Spain until it makes a stop. He makes a stop in southern Spain in the Doñana. After this stage in the Doñana, it has to make a sea crossing of a couple of 100 kilometers. And when it does so, it continues its trip along the coast, hugging the coast, making a stop in Western Sahara, and eventually arriving very close to Iwik, where it crosses over to the Big Mud Flats in the west of the Bandarguin. So this is a bird that connects the Wadden Sea with that other Wadden system on the coast of the Sahara. And this is the place where the next photo was taken. So we're back to this signpost, and you see a group of observers here walking in front of this signpost, looking at it and wondering about these huge distances. And these people, they carry telescopes because they're on their way to look for birds. Birds that carry individual identifiers, little rings that are put around the long legs of these birds. And by looking at these birds, by seeing which one is where, we can tell you how many birds are still alive and how many birds have died. And we go out on these mud flats, look at these big flocks, here a group of red knots in this particular case, on a seagrass bed on the Bandarguin, an intertidal flat that is exposed at low tide and gets covered at high tide. And in this particular flock of birds, you can actually see two birds with individual identifiers. And that is the basic method that we use in making these connections and finding out what is happening with these bird populations. Because these bird populations, they are changing a lot. As a person, I have been coming to the Bandarguin for the last 35 years, since 1980. This is an old picture. And in that period, the birds that we have been studied most intensively, the red knot that you saw pictures of before, have decreased in numbers enormously. In 1980, there were still 500,000 red knots wintering in West Africa. Now there is only 250,000 birds. This, of course, will affect the mudflats, but we're also curious what has happened in the meantime. Why have the numbers declined so much? And for that story, I have to take you to the whole flyer again. This is what is called the East Atlantic Flyway, connecting the high Arctic with the coast of Africa, with the Wadden Sea as its centerpiece, so to speak. Birds come together in the Wadden Sea in autumn before flying south, and some of them even stay in the Wadden Sea. So where in that migration route have the changes happened that make that there are so fewer knots now than there were 35 years ago? Maybe it has something to do with the tundra, where these red knots breed, 5,000 kilometers further north from the Wadden Sea. Now I'll come back to the tundra in a minute, but before that I'll give you some other elements of the puzzle. So red knots, they breed in the tundra. Here is a bird incubating on a nest, sitting in the snow, and at some point after 3.5 weeks, the chicks will hatch, the chicks will grow, and then all of these birds will fly south. Through the Wadden Sea, some of them will stop here, and then onto the Bandarguin. And coming from a huge area, over 80,000 square kilometers of breeding area, they will concentrate themselves in these flocks in a very small area, only 500 square kilometers of habitat that is left. So there's a huge squeezing of these birds in the course of their cycle. Now we've looked at these birds, at individually marked birds over a series of years, from 2002 to 2011. This is the work of PhD student Jutta Leirer. And we looked at survival on the Bandarguin and away from the Bandarguin. And to our big surprise, it turned out during these years, survival in May, August, away from the Bandarguin, was close to 100%. The likelihood of surviving was 1. Very surprising, because we thought that this long migration might take a toll, and maybe sometimes it does. And actually, the survival in the Bandarguin was lower than 1. So in the period September to November, in 2 months, 7% of the birds would die. And between December and April, the second half of the winter, 4% of the birds would die in 2 months. And the conclusion is that in this period, the red knots died in Mauritania, not during migration or the breeding season. And most likely, over the last 10 years, the changes in numbers have been caused by things happening on the Bandarguin. But even this is not the whole story, because what has happened in the Wadden Sea in the years before, between 1980 and the year 2000? Well, lots of things happened in the Wadden Sea that has affected red knots. For example, between 1990 and 2004, mechanical dredging for cockles was allowed using these huge ships that plowed up, sucked up the top layer of the sediment, negatively affecting the food sources of red knots. Smaller bivalves, not necessarily cockles. And we know this because we sampled over a big part of the Dutch Wadden Sea in these particular years. And what we found for the main area where red knots occur is that from the 1980s there have been very significant reductions in the number of what is its main food, Macoma baltica, in Dutch called nonnetje, in English Baltic talon. And in the early years we are talking about several hundreds Macoma per square meter available for these birds. But with the first fishery activity in the 90s, this was reduced with about 1/10 to about 10 Macoma per square meter. And with a second fishery incident in the early 2000s, this was actually reduced again tenfold to only 1 Macoma per square meter. And we know this has affected the red knots in proportion. So the decline of the red knots between 1980 and 2014 seemed to be caused first by something that has happened in the Wadden Sea, and secondly by things that are happening on the Bandarguin, where there is also change. Now how about the breeding grounds? Does that hold a clue to the future? And of course what we all know is that the world has to be coping with global warming. And this is a prediction of the amount of temperature change over the next 100 years on a latitudinal gradient. And what is very striking is actually that the polewards, the heating of the globe will actually increase. So on the tundra breeding grounds of these red knots, there is predicted to be a much greater climate change than further south. And actually we can already measure that on the basis of an analysis of satellite picture of snow cover, very important for these birds. What you see here is that since 1985, since the time we started looking at these animals, the date of snow melt has gone forward with about 1 day per year. And in all likelihood, this will affect the red knots, because whereas in the past they arrived on the tundra before the snow melt, now the snow has melted before they even arrive on the tundra, because we have no evidence that they have changed the timing of their migration. And this will, of course, affect what will happen later on during the year. The spring migration hasn't changed. After the laying of the eggs, 3.5 weeks, the young hatch. And they hatch at the time that the food resource in the Arctic peak. Now what will happen now, in all likelihood, is that with a heating up, an earlier snow melt, the food peak will come earlier. And this will mean that the chicks have to grow up with smaller food resources, which could mean that they actually don't grow as big as they did in the past. And that idea that the birds are actually becoming smaller and smaller, perhaps because of this climate change, is actually borne out. Because if we look at the body mass of birds arriving in Europe from the Siberian breeding grounds, we find that over the years they become smaller, and that this size is correlated with the date of snow melt for the Arctic. And this is true for the mass, and this is also true for the bill length. And it's then very easy to imagine that a change in the Arctic will affect what will happen in the Wadden Sea, with downstream effects on what happens in another Wadden system on the West African coast. Wadden systems are connected, and they are connected with the world. And the birds have a way to show us how these connections work. Bangladesh is connected with the Wadden Sea is connected with the tundra, and at a larger scale, all these birds connect the world, so to speak. This is a map of migration routes across the world with the Wadden Sea as the centerpiece, but over the world there are parallel routes where we are actually studying similar birds as well. And as we have seen, the world is changing, there is climate change, and as we have also seen, there is changes taking place on various parts along the flyway in the Wadden Sea, but also on the Bangladesh, and then along other flyways as well, especially the Yellow Sea and China. All these connections we will be trying to study within the NIOZ Wadden Systems Research Center.